Good afternoon. Does everyone have a handout? Okay, well, if you don't have one, share one. I think we're out of copies. I am not wired. We don't have PowerPoint. No, we do have paper. So please pay attention on paper. My colleagues this morning have given us a very broad spectrum of Jewish-Christian relations. I am going to severely limit it. I probably have the most specific topic. Today, I'm going to speak about missions to the Jews in England and the United States in a 100-year period between 1870 and 1970. So this is quite a different project than the very brave projects of speaking about the binding of Isaac, the book of Revelations, or Christian-Jewish relations generally. My colleague, Professor Ariel, with whom I am honored to be on the panel, along with Professor Inbari, in his book, Evangelizing the Chosen People, noted that before the 1880s, evangelizing Jews was not a high priority for American Protestants. Nor do early 19th century American evangelization efforts, and there were a few, compare to work carried out in Britain during the earlier part of the 19th century. This is part of a trend in the history of religions where enthusiasms start in Britain, evangelical Christianity for one. They're eventually dropped or lessened in Britain, and they take off in a very big way in the United States. So I use that to contextualize this issue of missions in a larger history of religions way. Among the projects embarked upon by 19th century British missionaries were translations of the New Testament into Hebrew and Yiddish, as well as translations of Christian liturgical works into Hebrew, not really into Yiddish. As the language of Jewish prayer is Hebrew, Christians wanted Christian prayers to appear in Hebrew. In my remarks this afternoon, my brief remarks, I will survey those translation efforts and then focus on the work of one remarkable author, translator, and missionary, Paul Philip Levertov, who lived from 1875 to 1954. And the dates of Levertov's activities fit very well into Professor Ariel's periodization. It's in the later 19th century that he's born. His activities as a missionary to Jews are focused in the first half of the 20th century, and that's when the British stop evangelizing Jews, but the Americans go at it with a passion I would say unabated. Now, in Professor Ariel's work, he notes that in 1970, we have the beginning of the Jews for Jesus movement and a whole different form of evangelization that also requires Hebrew. And if you're my age, you'll remember little pamphlets handed out in subways, bus stops, airports about Jews for Jesus with Hebrew words on them. Right? That was very, very common. And of course, now there's a whole net presence of evangelizing Jews using Hebrew. On page 1 of your handout, you'll see a copy, a photo, and some legend about the 1836 translation of the Book of Common Prayer into Hebrew. For those of you who read Hebrew, note Seder HaTfilah, the order of prayer, and the United Church of England and Ireland is called Kehilat HaMashiach, right? So this shows you that Messianic language is not something that came to us in the late 20th century, but it was there early in the 20th century and even before. As your copy notes, this translation was used at churches in London and Jerusalem, and if you visit Jerusalem and go to Christ Church at Jaffa Gate, you can still find copies of this Hebrew language prayer book. It was revised by Michael Alexander, a man who deserves a whole panel of his own, a British rabbi who became an Anglican churchman and was appointed bishop in Jerusalem in the mid-19th century. Later in the 19th century, English publication houses and American ones published many Hebrew and Yiddish translations of the New Testament, and this too is a subject that deserves more research. On the following page, you'll see a copy of, that is, if you turn over to the other side, a Eucharistic service written in Hebrew. This was published in the 1920s. And again, notice that the congregation is called Hasidim Meshichim, Messianic Hasidim, or Messianic pious ones. And the person who wrote it, who's called Reverend Paul Levertov on the bottom, identifies himself in Hebrew as Rav v'Kohen. He is both a rabbi and a priest. Now, who is this man who in the 1920s issued a Hebrew Eucharist and publicized it in a London congregation? His childhood is fascinating, but let's go to when he was about 25 years old, when he was already an active missionary to Jews in Europe. Levertov was born into a very prominent Hasidic family in White Russia, and he became a Christian at the age of 19. He worked for a group called Hebrew Christian Testimony to Israel, a mission to the Jews, and he became one of their prime workers and most efficient missionaries because he knew Hebrew, he knew Yiddish, and he knew rabbinics very well. And he was able to travel and talk to many, many congregations. Maybe a surprise to some of my colleagues who study rabbinics here. I hope it will be a surprise, because why be bored, right? That this man went to the famous Volozhin Yeshiva, right? He was a very eminent Talmudist, and he arrived at the yeshiva with a great deal of prestige because he was the grandson, well, it was a great-great-grandson of the brother of the founder of the Lubavitch dynasty, that is, of Shneir Zalman of Ladi. So Shneir Zalman's brother was the ancestor of this man, and he, the young man, and his father were in their youth very attached to the Chabad system. After a few years in the yeshiva, and this is a story very familiar in the annals of 19th and early 20th century Judaism, this Orthodox young man wanted to go to the university, but in Russia there was a very tight quota on who could go to the university. So his father, who was a quite wealthy Chassid, sent him to Königsberg to study. And there, he thought he would become a lawyer, but he found himself enchanted with the study of religion. And it's there that he first read the Gospels in a history of Christianity class in a German university. A year after being sent to the university, he came back home to his father, and as his daughter, the wonderful American poet, that is Levertov's daughter, Denise Levertov, says, he told his father that he had discovered the Mashiach in Germany. So he came back to his Hasidic family and he told them he had discovered the Mashiach. His family was appalled. When my father met his father's fury staunchly, it was decided in despair that he must be mad, and he was locked into his bedroom. But he fled. Yeah, I'm not using the mic correctly, right? How much do I have? Okay. So he fled, and he left the house. He went back to Germany, and he became converted into one of the evangelical churches. Now, a background to this conversion is that in the family already that had been a famous conversion to the Russian Orthodox Church. That is, the son of the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Chabad rabbi, became a Russian Orthodox Christian. And this has been since obscured, and you won't find it on the Chabad website. And don't write them about it, because you'll get on their hate mail list. Now, in my few minutes, what did this man Levertov accomplish? Using his very fine Jewish education, he proceeded to author a series of books in Hebrew about the basic tenets of Christianity. And in your handout, if you glance at it, and if you turn the page after the text of the Eucharist, you will see a book called Ben Ha'adam, Chaye Yeshua HaMashiach U'Pa'alav. The Son of Man. So here, Levertov is using the name from the book of Daniel that Christians later identify with the persona of Jesus, the Son of Man, the story of Jesus the Messiah and his doings. This book, published in 1911, was the first book written in modern Hebrew about Jesus. And I have to say, as a lifelong student of modern Hebrew and the emergence of modern Hebrew, this work is nothing less than a masterpiece. It's very beautifully written. This man was a master stylist. He, Levertov, recognized that he would have initially a small audience. And in the introduction to this book, he wrote, and those of you who study Judaica and Hebraics will recognize the sarcastic, biting tone of this comment. Jews do not know about Jesus, says Levertov, but how would a simple new Jew know about Jesus? Have any of our writers who are promoting a return to Zion and the revival of our language written about Jesus? The revival of our language, have any of them written about Jesus, Jesus who sought to return us to our land and revive our people? Have any of our modern writers living in the new 20th century sought to convey the ideas of the man from whose date of birth the centuries are counted? Have our Hebrew writers who are lustily quoting Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Kant, and Tolstoy, for your benefit, reader, have they thought to quote the ideas of Christian messianism? Absolutely not. Yes, these writers have given us a Hebrew language life of Muhammad. A life of the Buddha will no doubt soon appear, as well as a book about Mormons. But Jesus, who would mention his name? Isn't this a great irony and a terrible tragedy? And at the same time, it is a puzzle, one that is difficult to solve. But of course, there's an ironic tone here. Levertov knows the history of Jewish-Christian relations. He knows that his message will not be well received, but he persists. And eventually, he comes to London. He's ordained as an Anglican priest, and he sets up the congregation, the Hebrew church, in which the Eucharist service that you saw on page 1 is mentioned. He stayed there for 30 years, and through his doors until 1954 came all the great names of the Jewish scholarly tradition. And if you are a Judaica scholar and you own a set of the Zohar in English, Levertov is the third author, his authorship often obscured because he was a great master of mysticism. And I'll close, because I have only a minute left, with this strange occurrence. Is that Levertov, I thought, would be my province and would be forgotten, and I could write a paper and someone would say, Shalom, where did you find this? But I found in the last 2 years that Levertov has become a patron saint of Messianic Judaism. And if you go back to your computer and Google Paul Levertov Yortzeit, you will find out that in many churches, the date of his death is celebrated, and his book, Love and the Messianic Age, in which he compares John's Gospel, and I was very glad that we had to talk about John's Gospel, in which he compares John's Gospel to the teaching of the Baal HaTanya, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, has come back into print with an English commentary. You can find all this online. So I hope this small glimpse of a Jewish figure deeply, deeply committed to the Christian message, committed to bringing it to Jews, who died only 60 years ago, tells you something has shifted in the Jewish-Christian relationship, and I hope this little slice enlarges our conversation about Jewish-Christian relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goldman. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Ariel, who's going to discuss the rise of Messianic Judaism.
Hello. I hope that, terrific. First of all, welcome, and thank you for inviting me. I'll use the occasion to correct a small mistake. It's a very, very small mistake in the annals of human history, but it's a huge mistake in the annals of my scholarly history. My latest book is not Evangelizing the Chosen People. If you walk out here, you will see volumes of my latest book, An Unusual Relationship, Evangelicals and Jews, which tries to deal with the entire history and literary endeavors that have come out of what I would call the evangelical Jewish love affair, rather complicated love situation. And if I'm allowed to do so, probably not, but I'll do it anyhow. It's a terrific, terrific book to bring as a present to your friends. It's a wonderful bar mitzvah gift. And it's also a terrific book for anybody who wishes to promote Jewish-Christian reconciliation, dialogue, scholarly exchanges. So it's out there. And of course, you can order it in Amazon. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Goldman here very, very much, because I think the work he did saves me a lot of time and energy. Messianic Judaism, we hear a lot about it. Lately, just lately, you could hear about ex-President Bush visiting Messianic Jewish Bible Institute. To give you one example, this is an event that stirred more than interest, sometimes shock, sometimes joy, and celebrations. In some ways, it's the coming of age of Messianic Judaism. But while it is, at least in Jewish terms, a large movement with a few hundreds of congregations in America, including about a dozen in North Carolina, including in this area. And although it's larger than Reconstructionist Judaism and humanistic Judaism combined, it's not always well known. To give you one example, it's very common to confuse between Messianic Judaism and Jews for Jesus. Usually when people approach me, they speak, what about those Jews who accept Jesus? Those Jews for Jesus people. And of course, this is a total misnomer, because Jews for Jesus is just one group, a missionary, a declared missionary group with 100 and something members and with no congregations at this point. They had a few previously. And in fact, the relationship between Jews for Jesus and Messianic Jews is very intense and points to the complicated history and to the variety of the Messianic Jewish community today, or what is now known more neutrally as Jewish believers in Jesus. If this PowerPoint presentation can proceed, or I don't know if I can I do something about it, or?
It's probably going to be this button right here.
This?
Yes, the right button. There we go.
In their own minds, evangelical Jews relate to the early Jewish disciples of Jesus. In fact, those presentations that we heard here by a number of people were wonderful for that particular aspect of the movement, because Messianic Jews, even if they don't go into scholarly arguments, take sides. They make the claims that the authentic disciples of Jesus were Jewish, that being Jewish and a follower of Jesus was totally legitimate from a Jewish point of view, and certainly, of course, from a Jesus follower point of view in the first generations of Christianity. And they, in their self-understanding, those people in the early centuries of Christianity were Messianic Jews. A translation of the new, not a translation from the Greek, but a new edition of the New Testament in English related to the epistle to the Hebrews as a letter to the Messianic Jews. And if you see contemporary Messianic Jewish scholarship, you'll see that there is, first of all, a fascination with not just the Gospel of John, but the entire possibility of authenticating Christian Jewish communities, and that the movement today sees itself as a continuation of the early Christian movement, as the authentic, real Ur Christians in our times. That being said, we historians are very often tend to upset people. We upset parties and we upset the self-celebrations of communities of faith. We tell the Baptists, I'm here in rather a Baptist area, we tell the Baptists that they don't really follow the Anabaptists. They don't go back to the 16th century exactly. All such claims, we tend to historicize the development of movements, groups. Messianic Judaism is very much an outcome of the personalities, theologies, translations, and early communities that Professor Goldman has described to us, at least in part, facing a new phase in the 1970s when evangelical Christianity met the counterculture and met going back to one's roots movement and allowed and encouraged the creation of indigenous communities that combined, for example, Christianity with Native Americans' religion. It is also an outcome of the specific era that we could call the post-1967 era, where the image of Jews and Israel is transformed, both in the Jewish mind and in the evangelical mind. So very much, there's no way of understanding the rise of Messianic Judaism without looking at the long, passionate, complicated history of evangelical Jewish interaction. In many ways, evangelical theologians, leaders were preparing the way for the Messianic Jewish communities, if you will, just as much as what Messianic Jews call Hebrew Christianity, the earlier, more hesitant, more Protestant-oriented phase of Messianic Judaism prepared the way for that. I'm mentioning that because I'm pointing here to a book written in the 1960s by John Welvert, who was the president of Dallas Theological Seminary and was, of course, celebrating, if you will, the role of Jews and Israel in God's plans for humanity. Okay? Nothing happens. Okay. Here we are with what we could call a Hebrew Christian hymn collection, Lieder von Gläuben. I hope I pronounced the Yiddish correctly. I would have a problem with that. By Chaim Einspruch. I'm bringing Chaim Einspruch here because he was a leader of what was known as a Hebrew Christian community in Maryland, in Baltimore. He established what would later be known as the Lederer Foundation. That's the lady who gave him money. His great literary endeavor was a new translation of the New Testament into Yiddish, which he worked on in the 1930s, 1940s. By the time it came out, Jewish writers, Jewish men of letter celebrated the translation as the best Yiddish translation of the time, not just of the time, but of ever. But of course, he was writing already for a dwindling Yiddish-speaking Jewish community. Like many missionaries to the Jews, many leaders of the movement, his interest wasn't just missionary. He wanted to remain connected with his people, to remain connected theologically, politically, socially, and literally. And he was interested in those literary endeavors regardless of how Jews would, regardless of how many people they would bring to Christ, quote unquote. I'm bringing the leader here because a few dozen attempts have taken place in the 19th century, especially in England, in the United States, sometimes in other countries too, in Palestine to create, quote unquote, indigenous Jewish communities. But those communities usually, as we saw with Professor Goldman's presentation, very often were very close in their theologies and in their liturgy to their Protestant sponsors. They convent Jews, They were willing to allow Jews to convent separately, to create their own social milieu. They were willing to translate literature and liturgies into Yiddish, into Hebrew, but they were not willing to allow such communities what you could call theological and liturgical autonomy. That would be the major, if you will, revolution of Messianic Judaism. I don't know, I'm starting to really believe that great minds think alike. I used to think that great minds thought differently, but I see I was wrong. Here we have Levertov, the son of men. And again, this is again to show, there's no need anymore to show, the attempts, the more hesitant, more conservative, if you will, attempts as creating a unique Christian Jewish literature and communities. Hebrew Christianity is the term given to all such attempts, all such groups before the rise of Messianic Judaism in the 1970s. But Messianic Judaism, although Messianic Jews saw that as a revolution and were enormously energized by the idea that they're doing something new and exciting, going back to the roots of Christianity, amalgamating Judaism with Christianity, those two old-time enemy traditions supposedly, transferring old boundaries, they had their precedents. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, incidentally, is a good example of an Hebrew Christian who became at least moderately a Messianic Jew. Here we have a brochure by Jews for Jesus. Jews for Jesus shares with Messianic Judaism the incorporation of Jewish symbols, lingo, accepts what I would call Hebrew Christianity partially, but Jews for Jesus actually is not just that it's just an organization and not a movement. They believe in sending both their members, employers, and employees, and their converts to regular Protestant churches. So they are not exactly Messianic Jews. Here we have one of the early, larger, most vital congregations of Messianic Jews. This is written by Schuster, who established a Messianic Jewish community in Washington, D.C. And as you could see, this is a brochure that even tells you how to create such congregation. Messianic Jewish congregations have undergone since the 70s a process of that you could call Judaizing. That's not a good term because Judaizing was a tainted term before the 1970s, but a process in which their amalgam of Christianity and Judaism tended more and more to be not only more independent in their polity and liturgy, but also to rely more and more on the Jewish tradition, including on rabbinical Judaism. I'm taking to myself just one more minute. I think you can spare me that. You know, this is Christian charity and a mixture of Christian charity and Jewish median time. I'm pointing here to a brochure from Israel that the community used to be much, much smaller, of course, to the extent that some of the people here, believe it or not, I even knew personally. But this is a community that grew, Messianic Jewish community, between the 1970s, early 70s, in which there were about 300 Messianic Jews in Israel. We can talk today about 15,000 quite easily in over 100 congregations. Some of them Amharic speaking, some of them Russian speaking, some of them English speaking. But this is about really indigenous, if you will, Israelis who went through the military service and who, quote unquote, joined the Messiah. This is, of course, quite known active members. This is just to show the community is not just American, it's also growing in Israel, and it has representation all over the Jewish globe. I would say it's especially important to point to its presence in Russian, Ukrainian territories, where at times there are more Messianic Jews than there are members of conventional synagogues. The movement has quite a number, both in English, Hebrew, Russian, etc., of brochures, journals, periodicals. It's by nature, it is not only outgoing, outreaching, but missionary, in the sense that Messianic Jewish communities serve in and of themselves as centers of promoting a faith in Jesus. If you go into Messianic community, you'll see that each and every sermon, each and every week, promotes the basic entire evangelical message of the need to be born again in Christ, combined with an explanation why we are fully Jewish and fully Christian. It also shows you that one of the features of Messianic Judaism is dedication to Israel, and that Messianic Jewish communities, even more so at times than Jewish synagogues, incorporate Israeli symbols, Israeli songs, Israeli photography, discuss Israeli issues, organize yearly tours to Israel, invite members from Israel to lecture, and so on and so forth. That is, that the Israeli feature, the Israeli culture, has become very much part of Messianic Jewish life and identity. It's also a means of saying, of course we are Jewish. Look at our relationship with Israel. I'm trying to. Messianic Jews are engaged, together sometimes with other groups, in attempts to protect the rights and civil liberties, quote unquote, of Messianic Jews in Israel, contrary to a common perception. The Supreme Court's ruling of 1889 notwithstanding, thousands of Messianic Jews did settle in Israel, were registered as Jews. One of the most fascinating things that showed the relationship between Messianic Jews and the Jewish community has to do with conversions. Most members of Messianic congregations in America, the overwhelming majority, were not born and raised Jewish. It's particularly popular among mixed couples, quote unquote, or children of mixed couples. But there are many non-Jews who join such communities. My very provocative claim would be that people who choose such communities and spend long years there should be viewed, at least in parts, as converts to Judaism, not just as people who have accepted Jesus as their Savior. But I will tell you something that will amaze you. This has been going back and forth, and there are different schools, different ideas. Those people who wish to become Jewish within the Messianic Jewish milieu have to go a conventional, quote unquote. I wouldn't say even a conventional, because I don't think Messianic Jews would recognize reform conversions. They have to go halachic through halachic Jewish conversions under non-Messianic rabbis to stand in a Messianic community and say, well, I'm not just a member of the community, I've decided to become Jewish. There is, and this is as a homage to Professor Goldman, if there's ever a tract somewhere, published, I don't know, in India, China, Ethiopia, that has to do with Jewish-Christian relations, Professor Goldman knows about it and has a copy. With that, I'll end. One of the most amazing stories is, of course, the enormous the literature produced by those communities, which include by now thousands of brochures, hundreds of books, dozens of journals, and so on and so forth. The Messianic Passover Haggadah here is written by your neighbor, my dear friends, leader of a Messianic Jewish community here in Charlotte, our very own Sam Nadler. Saying our very own, his son was my student, and I take pride in the family. He was an A student, you see. This Haggadah is rather different than the way Levertov created liturgy. This is based on the Jewish Passover Haggadah with minor changes. Jesus is added into the picture, of course, but there's a recognition that what the celebrants want, both those minority who come from a Jewish background or were raised Jewish, and both those, the majority, who come from a non-Jewish background or are visitors, is a traditional Jewish Passover celebration. Haggadot is something that very often you can buy a standard Haggadah, but almost all communities have their own. So that's one example we have here. I can go on and on, but I don't want rotten eggs thrown at me. There's a lot of food out there. Some of it stood up for a while. So I better be careful. And I'll also, Professor Inbari, I also take enormous pride in him. He is a highly accomplished scholar, but my claim to fame, not his, was that I was a member of his doctoral dissertation committee at the Hebrew University. And so I take pride in whatever he has to say.
After such an introduction, what can I say? Thank you, Kobe, for being such a friend and colleague for such a long time. Okay, my topic is the American Evangelical response for Israeli Land for Peace solutions. And I'm a scholar of the Israeli society. And I recently published a book on the way in which the settlers' rabbis treat the dilemmas, the theological dilemma of territorial compromises. In the eyes of the rabbis, let's put it one step before. So in 1967, you probably know Israeli history. Israel conquered vast territories, and the way in which politics works in the Arab-Israeli conflict ever since is that Israel has to relinquish territories in order to get peace from the Palestinian side. And the rabbis are not very fond of this resolution because it comes from a biblical precedence according to which God made a promise to the offsprings of Abraham, and the Jews see themselves as the offsprings of Abraham, that they will have the land of Israel to call it home. Yes, and the entire land of Israel. Therefore, the territorial compromises are viewed as a violation to God's orders. Yes. And so I've published a book on that topic, and when I sent the prospectum to the publisher, it came back with a review, and I was required to compare it to other groups, and I was advised to compare it to the evangelical American contemporary evangelical response to this same question, yes? And so I have decided to study Christian Zionism, and I read Dr. Ariel's books, all three of them, and then I went on and continued my research on two evangelical pastors, famous evangelical pastors, Hal Lindsey and John Hagee. Now, what can we tell first of all, about Hal Lindsey? Hal Lindsey was the first, maybe if the first, but he's one of the first to associate the Israeli victory in 1967 with signs that are confirming that Jesus is going to come to earth for second coming, and it's going to happen very soon. Yes. He wrote a very famous book, The Late Great Planet Earth, sold 15 million copies, and so he's very famous for these kind of associations. And the other pastor, John Hagee, he in 2006 established a lobby in Washington called Christians United for Israel. Yes, and basically this is a political lobby that comes to show support of conservative evangelicals to the state of Israel. Now, what we can say about these two preachers that probably represent a big movement inside the evangelical world. According to statistics, there are about 70% of evangelicals are considered conservative, meaning following these lines that I'm going to talk about today, is that they follow two Christian doctrines which are called premillennialism and dispensationalism. What does it mean? It means that according to their view, Jesus is going to return to earth in the near future. This is not an event that already took place. It's going to happen in the near future, and it's very pessimistic. According to this outlook, there are a few events that are going to take place before the coming of Jesus, before the return of Jesus, which are, it's going to be the rapture of the church, and I'm just going to say it briefly, the rapture of the church, and the Jews going to need to rebuild the temple, and the Antichrist needs to come to show up his face, and then there's going to be an apocalyptic war, the war of Armageddon, and after that, Jesus will return to earth. Now, so I've mentioned that they are premillennialists. This is highly pessimistic view of how the future unfolds. And what I can say about their theology also is that they do not support the replacement theology. What does it mean? That they do not follow the doctrine that argues that the church replaced the Jewish people in the promise of being the chosenness. Therefore, according to their view, the events of the end of days have to do a lot with Jewish renewal or Jewish political renewal in the land of Israel. Okay, so when it comes to the conservative evangelical attitude toward Jews and Judaism, I've realized that there are two major commitments of these groups. One commitment is their commitment to the war of Armageddon, according to which, before the return of Jesus, there should be a great war, an apocalyptic war. And in the age of nuclear bombs, there is an understanding that this great war will be related to mass destruction. And according to their reading of scriptures and the book of Revelation that we had a lecture of earlier, the Jewish people will have to suffer greatly in that war, during that war. Now, the second commitment is for the blessing, and this is an interesting thing. According to Genesis, I don't remember exactly where in Genesis, when God created a covenant with Abraham and Abraham's seeds, he said to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in the way in which evangelicals, conservative evangelicals reading scriptures, they understand that they would receive a blessing if they would support the Jews. And if they will not support the Jews, if they will go on the contrary, they will be cursed. And it is very strong in their understanding, in their attitude for the Jews. Yes, their support for the Jews will bring blessing on them and blessing on America. Now, they also understand that these two commitments do not go together. The war of Armageddon is not necessarily something which is very good for the Jews. Yes? You understand it? Okay, so here, there is a contradiction here, logical contradiction. And this is why Christians United for Israel was established as a lobby in America, in the political corridors, to support Israel. The purpose of this lobby was in order to prevent Iran, I'm going to repeat the word, prevent Iran turning nuclear. So now, look at this. If the Christians, conservative Christians, evangelicals, needs to make a decision between, from one hand, hastening the end with the war of Armageddon, and from the other hand, supporting the Jews, and I'm holding the microphone. It doesn't work. Well, they support the Jews. Yes, they support the Jews. Okay, so with this understanding, they prefer to see the Jewish well-being is more important than the coming of Jesus. Now, let's look at Israeli territorial compromises. Now, according to their view, they want the Jews to be happy. The rabbis in Israel, they oppose territorial compromises because it's based on biblical narrative. Now, we know conservative evangelicals in America, they are also literalists. So let's check their attitude. Now, if there will be, this is the way in which I read Hagee and Lindsay and others. If there will be a peace solution in the Middle East where Jews and Muslims would be happy, Christians will not oppose it. Yes, if Jews and Christians cut a deal and everybody is happy, they are not going to oppose it. But they would oppose American intervention that will force Israel into territorial compromises that Israel doesn't want. Okay, you see the logic? They don't want American to interfere in the peace process. But they don't mind that Jews and Muslims will cut a deal between another, and it will inhale, there will be territorial compromises will be part of that deal. As long as Jews are happy, they are happy too. However, there is only one red line for the evangelicals, and this is the Temple Mount. According to their reading of Scripture and their understanding of the events that are going to take place in the near future, the Temple Mount is very important because some events that are related to the end of days had to take place under Jewish rule. Jews need to rebuild the temple, and the Antichrist need to show up to that temple, and then this will fuel the events that will lead to the end of days. So, on any type of compromises, they are not going to be disturbed as long as Israel is happy. But when it comes to the Temple Mount, this is their red line. They don't want it to turn Muslim because they believe it has to be Jewish for the end of days events. So I did it before, and I'm done.
Turn to questions from the audience.
Okay, well, this question's... Oh, okay. Well, in the absence of Kobe, I guess I'll ask either Kobe or Motti can answer this question, perhaps. When you say, they want the Jews to be happy and they haven't relinquished their chosenness, and I know I've asked Yaakov this question before too. At the end of it all, ultimately the Jews still need to accept Jesus, though, right? Even for the most, I don't want to use the word liberal, but the most expansive evangelical reading of seeing the Jews as having some sort of place as the chosen people still. Ultimately, at the end, is there still the expectation that the Jews need to accept Jesus or else?
The answer is yes and no, in the sense that it's yes in the sense that by the time Jesus returns, those Jews who are alive at that time, about a third of the Jewish people, will accept him as their savior.
Is this the good for the Jews or the bad for the Jews?
From an evangelical point of view, there is a recognition that the apocalyptic era, which stands between this era and the millennial era will be the harshest time ever in the history of the Jewish people. On the other hand, the evangelical understanding is that once Jesus shows up, those Jews who are there will welcome him as their brother. They will then be reinstated as God's first nation. The world is still organized during the millennial era in nations. Every nations live in their land. The Jews live in the land of Israel. That's where the international government is situated, with Jesus as the governor, the Prince of Peace, and the Jews as his assistants, evangelists, and administrators. From an evangelical point of view, the period before Jesus' arrival is catastrophic. The period after Jesus' arrival is absolutely the dream of every nation.
Is there predestination in here? I mean, is it predetermined?
It is predetermined, but the understanding is that the Jews would turn from a nation that doesn't as a whole, does not accept Jesus as a whole, into a nation of Jesus throughout the period of the Great Tribulation, quote unquote, or the time of Jacob's trouble, quote unquote. Those are parallel periods, but for the Jews it's a particularly harsh period, for humanity at large.
Okay, so responding to the gentleman's question, but also asking a question of my colleagues. In your talk, Motti, you said, well, 70% of evangelicals are conservative. I think that figure means that they're politically conservative, that they might vote Republican. I don't think that it means that 70% of evangelicals believe in this theology. And we have the master here, Yaakov. Your representation of the theology is, I know, completely accurate. But I want to offer a different view about Christian Zionism and Christian-Jewish relations. I think it's much more about Genesis than about the book of Revelation. I think it's much more about the world being created and God assigning places to nations, and then especially assigning the land of Israel. The more I look into this, in a way as your student over the last decade, the more I see Genesis as important and Revelation as less important. And I really don't think that 70% of American evangelicals would recognize the theology we're describing. So I'd like to hear both of you to answer that.
I agree. I agree and I don't agree at the same time. Again, I think that I think it depends on the. As far as statistics go, you're right. Moreover, there are certain segments of conservative evangelicalism that don't hold to dispensational premillennialist theology. For sure, for example, this particularly, and then this is amazing historically, there's an historical irony here. If you look at the roots of the evangelical attitude and theology relating to the Jews, actually those evangelicals, I think the statistics is about 30% who are related to the Reformed tradition today, usually don't follow dispensationalist theology. This again goes even back to the history of what is known as the fundamentalist movement. There are, particularly today, evangelical academicians, including in very conservative seminaries, who are critical of dispensational theology, particularly in relation to Middle Eastern policies. That being said, so far, throughout the 20th century, almost all, in fact, I would have to think who won't. In the entire 20th century, I cannot think of one known major evangelist in America who did not promote, in one way or another, that particular theology. I would also make the claim, and I hope I'm not insulting my highly esteemed, highly learned colleagues here, that while very often I hear from evangelical academicians that we don't fully subscribe to that, and I hear affirmation of your understanding, that usually their books are sold by the few dozens or few hundreds, while I'm not talking about the late great Planet Earth, this is 1970s, while Left Behind caught the intellectual evangelical elite by surprise. It sold 60 million copies. And by no means do I make the claim that the people who read the book subscribe to dispensational theology. In fact, I would make the claim that a very small minority subscribe to it. But the book worked to give some people at least an idea, to make the vocabulary and the lingo familiar. It worked to, there's a core of, I would say, that are theologically convinced, but there's a larger periphery of conservative evangelicals who are willing to give it a room, some space. But I would go even beyond that and say, although most people read the book didn't necessarily subscribe to dispensationalist theology, they subscribed to the political and moral messages of the series. In other words, what I'm saying is that those ideas, while most conservative evangelicals perhaps don't subscribe to them, have still a lot of political power in them.
Well, I think we need to hear from our colleague, because we're not going to get a chance to do this again. I think the audience will also benefit.
Okay, I just want to add that what I've realized is there's a shift in the emphasis now of evangelicals. Maybe in the 70s, the 80s, the focus was on the Armageddon and the war and all that, and now the shift is now moving toward the blessings that they would receive by being good to Jews. And so I think this is the transformation where they're moving on.
Yes, it was very telling that Motti didn't know the chapter and verse. See, if he had a good Protestant education, he would know it was Genesis 12:3. And I have seen, just like you see John 3:16 on road signs, I have seen Genesis 12:3 on road signs. So I want to confirm what you're saying. They didn't teach us to cite the Bible that way.
Thanks to all three of you. As just one quick follow-up point, I'm a statistician and a survey methodologist. Anytime you hear a number about sort of a specific percentage of a detailed religious belief, treat it as an estimate with very high confidence intervals around it. Thank you.